Where's the mark? Yeah, so at recent coalition steering committee meetings, we've been trying to think of what are things that we ought to be learning about, educating ourselves about that would be valuable to advancing downtown vision, the downtown and greater downtown Los Altos. And thought floor area ratios would be a very good thing for us to be learning about. It was interesting to see on the projected council agendas, something that isn't yet scheduled for a specific date. Floor area ratios is something they're going to be looking at, so hopefully this will help inform us all about that. And I'm really delighted that Bill Maston agreed to do this very quickly. Bill has been a great contributor to the community. He, and not only our community, but Mountain View, he's a local architect. He's been on the Mountain View Downtown Committee, which has done a great deal to contribute to increasing the vibrancy of downtown Mountain View. He was on the Los Altos Parking Committee, contributed a great deal there. He's done other presentations on topics that were very useful. So, Bill, thanks so much for taking the time today to come and help us understand floor area ratios.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, I actually probably know most all of you here, so this, it's a very friendly environment for the most part, and there's always those unknowns, of course. But I probably am not actually the guru of floor area ratios, but I think I can do a lot to kind of help us understand a little bit what we're up against in terms of defining what floor area ratios are and how they can contribute to designing downtowns in particular, or actually anywhere in any city. And so with that, if we could kind of get this thing rolling a little bit. As part of just starting this off, I actually want to end up this presentation today with giving us some kind of live examples of how we could apply it downtown, especially since the visioning process, actually one of the tools that we use in the visioning process as a next step is understanding floor area ratios, or FAR, and how they can be applied to your vision for the future. So basically, floor area ratios can be used to calculate the maximum allowable square footage, not only for a downtown, for example, but for a whole city, but for individual buildings. And the advantage of that is it actually helps take a tool of your vision. For example, if in the visioning process we're talking about creating vitality, that maybe would mean that in order to have that vitality, you need to increase the amount of square footage available to be developed downtown to get that vitality. So for today's meeting, I just wanted to let you know these apply for everywhere in town, not just downtown, but the focus for me today is a little bit more towards dealing with downtown. So what I mean by defining the master plan of a city area, in the visioning process, we're looking at this idea of trying to understand what will bring vitality downtown. And if there's this direct relationship between vitality in your downtown, there's usually a direct relationship to the square footage that's being built downtown. So, for example, we already know, or at least we can calculate, how much square footage we already have downtown. That's pretty easy. We can go through not only Google, which we'll see here soon, but we can go through all the building permits, and we can calculate the amount of square footage that we have downtown. We can also then calculate quite simply what our current tax base is downtown, and it starts giving you tools to understand that if you increase square footage of your downtown amongst all of your buildings, it can actually have a direct correlation between your vitality, your economic income, and so forth. So it can also be used as different tools, and I'm going to focus a little bit on that as well, as it can actually help dictate not only the size of your building, but the massing of the building, the architectural forms of the building, and it has impacts on other things. So usually in the cities that I work with, it also has a direct impact on parking requirements. And the reason for that is if I have a floor area ratio that is quite high. So let's say instead of having 5,000 square foot building, I have a 10,000 square foot building. It may actually mean that I need twice as much parking as if it was a smaller building. So you can actually take your floor area ratio and apply parking requirements to it, and that will tell the owner of that building how many parking spaces he may need to provide in order to build the building of the maximum height. Now, if we can move on a little bit, there's other things that are going to contribute to this, and I've broadly already talked about implementing a master plan or your visioning process for downtown. And since everybody seems to be talking about increasing the vibrancy downtown, the question will become, well, how much increased activity do we need through adding additional new square footage to your downtown do we actually need in order to get that vibrancy and still perhaps maintain the village character of Los Altos, as we like to say. And so, for example, if we all built 10-story buildings, well, that's going to totally change the character of downtown, and it may not necessarily give us the vibrancy that we want downtown. So you can actually use your FAR to find that nice balance that you want that gives you the character of your downtown. And if you can not only have FAR for your whole downtown, for example, in downtown Los Altos, we actually don't have FAR for individual buildings. Now, for those of you that have residential homes, I can actually go to your lot, I can take the square footage of your lot, and I can talk with planning staff, and I know exactly how many square feet I can put on my site. And so it's very easy for an architect to then be able to define the limits that the architect would have in building your home, your new home. The same thing can be done with applying FAR to downtowns as well. But the interesting thing about downtown Los Altos right now, the FAR in the downtown business district actually doesn't exist. There's other things that are dictating what you can do or not do downtown, and that's really more or less based upon parking or the size of your lot and other contributing factors. But with that, the reason why I bring up zoning density is that in your downtown right now within our triangle, we have different types of uses. We have general commercial, we have residential, and we have mixed uses in between. And each one of those actually has different parking requirements, for example. And if it was 100% residential, your parking requirements may be different than if it was 100% commercial. So finding that blend kind of tells you the complexity of what it's going to take you as a city in the upcoming months when you try to take the vision of downtown and transform it into data points that we as architects can use to help accomplish your goals. So besides the density, meaning the total quantity of square footage or use downtown, it can also regulate building forms. And you'll see in a little bit that that's really my focus later because it's kind of fun to work with as an architect. It can be used to determine the parking requirements, also enhance architectural elements and limit or encourage development. And it can incentivize developers to actually build something rather than leave it the way it is now, which is do nothing and lose more business. So the interesting thing that a lot of people don't discuss much is it can also increase your tax base by regulating your FAR. Now, for example, I have been to probably 100 meetings where someone says, well, you can't do anything to help the developer. I mean, that's horrible if you give an incentive to the developer. But in reality, what you're doing is giving the incentive to the city to increase their tax base. Because if the developer is actually building something, the net win down the road is the city, because you're getting not only increased tax base from the increased value of the real estate, but you're making the assumption that you're getting increased retail taxes as well. So the next part I wanted to go over is just talking about how we actually calculate FAR and what should be included in it or what maybe should not be included in it. Interesting enough, the parking committee in Los Altos, part of their responsibility was to define what FAR is and how it should be applied. And so almost everything that's in these examples here are actually within the proposed guidelines that are going through the Planning Commission and soon to go to the Council. So if we take FAR in general, what I'm talking about is taking the exterior walls all the way up to however many floors it is of the building and counting everything inside of it. So I'm taking the actual building form, whether it's 1 story or 3 stories tall, and I'm just adding up all the square footage inside, and that's my floor area ratio. However, there's some things I'd like to talk about here, which you might wonder whether or not they should be included or not included in your calculation. And I want to talk first about lobbies because, for example, I've had developers say to me, I want my lobby to be as small as possible because I can't rent that lobby. So I don't care about anything else. I want rentable space. So as an architect, I'm going, wait a minute, a beautiful lobby enhances my building, it enhances my downtown. I want that lobby. But the primary reason for the developer not wanting to build that lobby is because it counts against him. Okay, so I'm actually would be a proponent of saying, you know, everybody needs a lobby, some of it should count, but if the purpose of an increased size of a lobby is just for the benefits of architecture, maybe there should be a method in working with planning staff where it doesn't count. So staircases and elevators and mechanical rooms and garbage rooms, they are kind of just the mechanics of the building. They're a necessity of a building, and since I'm not able to really rent that space, maybe that shouldn't be counted in the FAR. Or some communities will actually just adjust the FAR to accommodate the fact that a portion of your building is not actually rentable space. Now, interesting enough, I talk about courtyards because of the way we define something else. So not only in Los Altos, but in many communities I work in, if I have a courtyard that's enclosed on 4 sides, right? So let's say I have a central courtyard in the middle of my building, it actually counts as square footage. Because if you remember that one of the purposes of FAR is to regulate massing of a building and how it looks, since I can't see that courtyard and it's surrounded by 4 sides, it's not reducing the volume of my building, then many planning departments say a courtyard counts as square footage. So now developers don't want to build courtyards because they can't rent the courtyard. And so again, it's contributing or hindering architects in perhaps providing better architecture. So, and I'm going to come back and talk about that definitely a little bit more when we get into some further graphics. But same thing goes with thickness of walls. So let's say that I have a building that has an, for sake of conversation, it's a Mediterranean style, and I have these beautiful arches, and the arches are 2.5 feet thick. In almost every community I work in, those arches and the thickness of those arches count as square footage or FAR. So as an architect, I'm sitting there listening to the developer said, I don't want any thick arches because I don't get to rent those arches. So again, our ability to actually have some flexibility on the part of planning staff to define what could be an arch or what could be an architectural enhancement without increasing FAR, from an architect's point of view, I like that. However, perhaps from a planning point of view, it just adds to the burden of having to define what is square footage and not square footage. And you can have language that helps define that pretty well. In addition, you have a public review process where we can kind of verify that, yes, the purpose of these architectural elements are to benefit architecture, not benefit usable rentable square footage. So another interesting thing is rooftop decks. They're kind of getting to be the new in thing to do in a lot of developments, especially in higher density developments where we don't have a lot of area at the ground level for indoor-outdoor spaces. They're putting them on roofs. The question comes up of whether those roof decks or not should count towards floor area ratio. I could give you an example. For example, if it was a rooftop restaurant, there could be a lot of cars coming to your building that were not necessarily intended with FAR calculations. So there could also be benefits if it's a residential project. If the roof was just for the benefit of the residential project, it wouldn't have any further impact on parking or other components, but definitely add to the benefits of those people living there, and perhaps then your rooftop deck wouldn't count towards FAR. And I've worked in some communities where a portion of the rooftop deck actually did count, meaning the stairwell counted and any canopies on that rooftop deck counted towards FAR, but nothing else did. So I prefer the idea of just not having it count at all, because we're going with the concept that the FAR was there to help regulate the massing and size in the architecture. The last one to talk about, which is something Los Altos already implements, and almost every city I work with implements, is the idea that basements don't count. If the concept of floor area ratios was in part to regulate building massing and architectural elements, since you can't see a basement, let's not count it. It also encourages two other things: to put all your mechanical type elements in the basement, as well as parking for the most part. So whether it be downtown or along El Camino, or even in our other residential areas, basements go a long way to help reduce massing and regulate the size of your buildings. So the next thing I wanted to do is talk about a few other elements that actually affect FAR. And we'll get to some graphics on this pretty soon. But really, lot coverage is something I need to introduce here, because your floor area ratio many times is it's regulated by a couple other factors, which is lot coverage or open space or landscape requirements. So those are actually by themselves, because it's reducing the footprint of what you can build on, it will affect your FAR. So it can define architectural forms as well, and building massing. It can definitely define open spaces, or in some cases, eliminate the desire for someone to provide open space, especially when you're in a downtown area. And so it can also be used to encourage these things, meaning more usable outdoor spaces and landscape areas, and encouraging outdoor uses, especially when you're downtown. So with that, we're going to kind of move into some things a little of this you've seen before, but I wanted to use an old example as what's going on downtown. So right now downtown, all we did earlier was take some Google Maps and take the sizes of the buildings that we know are downtown, and we're actually able, we can go through and just add up all the existing buildings downtown, and we could pretty easily tell you what we think the total FAR is for the downtown business district. Now, in the visioning process, they're making certain recommendations of what it takes to implement your vision. So you can then go through the downtown and add those things up and say how much more you need, and then you could actually formulate some floor area ratios that would kind of allow you to do that. So what I wanted to do was actually focus on 400 Main Street, and in part because it's something I've already done before in terms of showing you what could have been done versus what was done. Now, this particular project, obviously it's built now. They did not have a FAR, but, and they did obviously what they thought was going to be best for downtown. And they did some things that I also thought were important for us to discuss, which is the idea of this central courtyard that's connecting. It has some nice architectural benefits because it's at the ground floor. It can provide outdoor spaces, but it also has massing effects not only on First Street, but other areas downtown. Now, in some cities, the covered courtyard that's there, the breezeway, actually would count as floor area because it's covered, even though it's open on two sides. So defining FAR can actually have unintended consequences, really, if you're trying to get people to use the outside. So this alternative that I had provided years ago for a city council meeting was really a way to just let you know that this alternative has the same FAR, so same square footage, same amount of underground parking. Everything is identical to what was built, but by changing the location of certain building elements, it actually created more usable open space. And so again, FAR can be used as an effective tool to kind of create those benefits that you want to see through your visioning process. So again, FAR is something that's not standalone. It really does need to be integrated with other elements, which could include lot coverage, landscaping, public spaces, and so forth. So then what we did, and excuse me for the people in the room who I chose their building to use, but it was a nice big rectangle. I just took a building, and I took this building in part because there's a courtyard in it, and I wanted to talk about that in the big picture. So again, what we're doing is saying, hey, it's pretty easy for us to go through and talk about what happens with buildings when you look at it from an FAR standpoint. Now, from the visioning process, one of the next steps could be, oh, well, what happens if I have a 3.0 FAR? So what does that mean? That means I'm taking the size of the site, and if it's 100 by 200 square feet long, you know, if it's 1 story tall, it's 100%. If it's 2 stories tall, it's 200%, 300%, and so forth. So all we did was take this lot here, 1 story tall. It's currently 2 stories tall. If it was 100%, we'd have an FAR of 100, 100. So this 300 FAR. Actually, just so you know, for many communities, that's very high. Even along El Camino in Mountain View, it's only like anywhere from 1.35 to 1.85. So depends on setbacks and other issues. So you could actually then take this and say, you know what? I don't want my building to be 300%. I want it to be a little less than that because I need to regulate some of the things that are going on in it architecturally. And I just took this and said, okay, here's 100% on the ground floor because that's retail, and the next 2 floors I just stepped back. Now you'll see as we go through the graphics on this, it's a mix and match. Architecture is something that's created, so I'm not suggesting that it be boxes the way we showed first. Now the reason why I did the sawtooth, imagine if each one of these was a courtyard where there might be a restaurant or there might be something else that engages people indoors and outdoors. Okay. Also in this, all I did was reduce the 3rd floor FAR, but I wanted to point out when you do this, it reduces the massing, but unless I do it on the 4th floor, it actually might increase the appearance of the massing because it's up high like that. We went a step farther and then said, well, what else could we do? And by the way, some ways FAR is regulated is by allowing people to go more than 3 stories. Let's say you allowed someone to go 4 stories, but you did not change the FAR. That will encourage them to step the building back and to actually reduce the appearance of the massing of the building. So floor area ratios actually can be this effective tool to help regulate the massing of buildings as well. So I mentioned courtyards. And I wanted to talk about courtyards for a different reason because they have a really effective tool in, for example, increasing the usable ground floor areas as well as massing, which we've already talked about. And you'll see as we go through this, I'm just trying to, again, let you know what effectively happens as a tool. So in some communities, it's enclosed on 3 sides. It counts as FAR. I don't necessarily agree with that because now it limits me, or more importantly, the developer says, Bill, I don't want a courtyard. I can't rent it. So now we get to play a little bit. So just so you know, we cut this thing up into just cubes just for a demonstration here because it's kind of fun. You get to pick and choose, right, how to create the architectural forms that are going to kind of give you this vision for downtown. So we increased the size of the courtyard just to match the cubes, by the way, for simplicity here. But if you want to kind of have Alex just kind of play around a little bit. Let's say that the planning department says, you know, I'd really like to make sure that you have an outdoor restaurant on the corner, and if you could push it back a little bit, that would be nice. We'd like that. So you can do that, and you know what? We now have this corner place, and we can regulate. We can actually count up what the FAR is. It's probably about 2.7, 2.8, somewhere in there. We can now come back and say, well, wait a minute. We kind of like some of the things about your courtyard, but we can't see the courtyard, so how can we address that? So we're going to actually get rid of a little square footage there. And matter of fact, wow, we have this courtyard. How about if we open it up to the parking lot so people can go directly from the parking lot through? Now, again, we're just using this as a way to regulate FAR, but also as a way to help actually implement your downtown master plan or your downtown visioning plan. And so the advantage actually for a developer would be, oh, wow, I just got a lot more ground floor glass for retail space. So it's not like the developer is necessarily losing an opportunity. They may be gaining an opportunity. Okay? And FAR is definitely one tool that can be used in that. So let's say, though, that you're going, wait a minute, that FAR is a little too much because I'm concerned about the building massing. Again, we can just do things architecturally to help regulate the massing and so forth. And then I'm going to be the developer. I'm going to say, wait a minute, you're taking all this FAR away from me. I would still need the same amount of FAR to accomplish what you asked me to do in the visioning process, which was to provide you with vibrancy. So you know what? If we were to allow a certain portion of this FAR to go to a 4th floor, and by the way, if you're in a town that only wants 3 floors, it's just, again, it doesn't matter which floor it's on. We're just trying to say, you know, there's some opportunities here that we could use to allow some development on a higher level, to allow rooftop gardens, for example, and not increase the massing of the building. Because keep in mind, when you're walking at the street, above a 2nd floor, if your building is stepped back, you usually can't even see it, right? If it's stepped back 10 or 12 feet, then at least on the side of the street you're walking on, you can't see it. You can see it, of course, from across the street. So in general, these tools, and FAR is definitely one of them, really gives cities, and in our particular case, our downtown, or by the way, any shopping center along El Camino, or over by Homestead, all the different places, including Loyola Corners, you have these tools available to do that. So even though I'm not here to talk about building setbacks or about lot coverage, just to let you know, they also factor into how you utilize FAR, and hopefully this kind of gives you an idea of what FAR is, how it can be used as an effective tool. And I don't think at this point I work in any city where FAR is not a factor. And now I'm going to go one step farther. We have some existing documents in the city for downtown that were used by people to develop things the way we are now, and they were developed all the way back in the 90s, which was the design guidelines for downtown, for example. Under the visioning process that we're just finishing up, those are the new guidelines. So the key is, how do you take that vision document and then translate it into something that's workable that I get to use as an architect to help you, accomplish that vision. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions and let you know that's, I guess, where we are with FAR today.
Questions? Everybody knows everything, Bill.
Yeah.
Oh, we got one there.
Yeah.
So, what does downtown have today?
In terms of?
The guideline. It's not FAR.
No, we have no FAR for the existing downtown as it is today.
So what are the guidelines?
Technically, well, if you're within the parking district, you will get a credit from a parking standpoint. But right now, if you wanted to, and you could provide all of your parking on site, and you had the right size lot, your FAR would only be limited by the height restriction for that particular lot. So, however, within the guidelines, there are, for example, direction that says we don't really essentially say we don't want a box. We don't want you to have 3-story box or a 2-story box. Now, interesting enough, most cities, if you say, oh, I want to limit it to 1 story, you're going to get a box. But if you allow someone to go 2 or 3 stories and don't change the FAR, you will most likely get a building that's graduated and effectively does some of the things that we showed here. I think you were next, and I'll come.
Does the fenced-in patio, say on a restaurant, does that count towards FAR?
If it's ground floor and just a fence, and you can see the sky above, most often, no, it doesn't count against you. It would, and actually one of the things that's interesting, if you go into downtown areas, and sometimes you'll see, large windows that are operable, so it's indoor-outdoor space while they're open. Another option is where, especially in downtown Palo Alto, you may have 12 or 15 feet where they move the actual storefront wall or restaurant wall back, and so they have outdoor seating. Those are kind of evolving and getting this interaction. And I know from a parking standpoint, in some of those communities, even though they have a roof on them, that parking is now exempt, and that's why it encouraged them to actually create that outdoor space. So one thing, could you just move, take just this one back in? So in most communities, because this is a roof on top of it, that counts as FAR. But imagine if that was all outdoor seating for a small cafe. You know, which is really what I think are one of the elements in our visioning process that it's saying they want us to do. Then we would want to make sure that we defined how this was treated from an FAR standpoint. And the benefit also is that, for example, what we're trying to encourage is just that indoor-outdoor interaction. Then we're meeting our visioning process, but we're also, it does put a little burden on planning staff to define how this is used. Yes. Oh, sorry. Pardon?
What cities use
Every city I work in. I would say it might be easier to ask what cities don't use. At the moment, almost every city I work in the Bay Area, which I don't do much in some cities, but whether it's San Jose, Saratoga, Los Gatos, Los Altos, and the residential side, all of Mountain View, Palo Alto, you name them, everybody uses FAR. It's an effective planning tool. Do you know of any that? No? Yeah, I don't. Yes.
Bill, could you explain to people, when you say that there's no FAR in the original parking district, explain why when we've had numerous examples of somebody wanting to put a 100-square-foot office on the second floor of a building, they were denied by the planning department because they were told that they already were using 100% of their lot coverage, and therefore they could not add a 100-square-foot office up above. Yet there's at least, by my count, 46 buildings that have grandfathered in second-floor uses that clearly are using more than 100% floor area ratio, and that's the one thing that 90% of the citizens of our town did not understand.
So I'll try to answer it the best I can, but from my understanding is it actually was more related to parking issues, not to FAR issues.
People need to know that.
Right.
Because there's this sense that, oh, they can do it, why are they complaining? They can do whatever they want.
Right. So in the downtown area right now, if you belong to the parking district, you were 100% exempt from any square footage equivalent on 100% coverage of the ground floor. So if you wanted to do a second floor, unless you could provide that parking on site, you could not build anymore. And so that's, again, where the perception has come from, that it was being regulated by design, but it was really being regulated by the lack of ability to provide additional parking on site. That's, for most cases, that's what I believe.
Isn't that de facto the same thing as having FAR?
Well, no. I mean, if someone, assuming the lot size was conducive to efficient parking layout, and they could provide underground parking, then they could do that. They could add more square footage. So just so not to diverge too much, but old downtowns, including Los Altos, the average width of a lot was originally only 25 feet wide. And so when you had a 50-foot lot, well, that was pretty good size. But guess what? Our minimum width for an efficient parking lot is 64 feet. So you would actually need 3 lots in order, meaning 75 feet in width, to actually get an efficient parking layout. So that's the major reason why so many parking districts were created, including the one in Los Altos, because it was acknowledging that these narrow lots would never allow efficient parking. So by them banding together to create the parking district, it solved that problem for them. And that's happened in so many communities across the United States. I think it's kind of, standard practice at one point in their evolution of a city to create these parking districts. Yes, sir.
Do you have any kind of an estimate of the de facto FAR downtown right now?
I personally don't know, but I could pretty easily just take these drawings and find out. Yes, we have a 1.0.
Building is, that the downtown is approximately 100%.
So 1.0 for the FAR. Okay. So that's
Land in the buildings,
mm-hmm.
you get 432,000 square feet of land, 435,000
The total.
The total.
Right, because there's lots of lots that aren't 100% covered with building. They have little parking areas behind them, and that's the whole triangle, by the way. Yeah. Yes?
Do any of these, many other cities that use FAR, do they ever do any trading with FAR in exchange for some public benefits? The one I'm particularly interested in would be impact fees that might help affordable housing.
So I read about that all the time, absolutely, where in a sense, that concept of trading FAR for public benefits is definitely been used a lot, and actually I believe it was directly or indirectly applied to the affordable housing issue, where they're allowed to go to an additional floor in exchange for providing affordable housing. It's the same concept, and it has been used in Mountain View, and definitely if the different things that I've read, it's been used all around the country, yeah, as a way to incentivize people to build. You know, that is definitely something that you want to take into consideration in the visioning process. When there's actually a tough, hard step ahead of the city, actually, regarding the visioning process, to actually take your vision and then translate it into a physical environment that is taking into consideration FAR, parking, setbacks, and all the other tools that we use. That's a huge challenge, and it's a big responsibility. Yes?
I know, along those same lines, so we know from the visioning, the community does want more outside seating and wider sidewalks. So I'm curious, what are some of the tools, maybe FAR is one of them, that we could still use to incentivize developers? Because if we do have those wider sidewalks, more outdoor seating without the hard rooftop, what are some of the things we can still use to incentivize owners and developers? What would that look like, the FAR of that thing on together?
So one way many times is just to allow a partial additional floor. Because if your top floor is reduced in size, visually it's not necessarily at all increasing the massing of the building. It's not increasing any shadowing of the building. So that can always be one way to do that, where you say, look, we'll let you go to 4 floors if you give us a courtyard that's 40 feet by 80 feet or something of that nature. So that they're not being penalized in that regard. They're being given some flexibility in exchange for, you know, some public benefit. Yes?
So, Bill, this is wonderful to see, and I love the visions and the pictures. As you know, we're not the first city to go through a process, I'm sure, of going from visioning and then through a FAR concept and then create rules and regulations to implement them. You know, I know Santa Cruz went through it because they had to because of the earthquake.
Mm-hmm.
But what best practices can we learn so we don't have to reinvent the wheel in this transition you just spoke about,
Mm-hmm.
visioning to implementation of FAR and other things to actually have an outcome so we don't have another Safeway or things like that?
So, well, first of all, it's having good consultants. You have a consulting team on board now that helped with the visioning process. In our particular case, as a small community, we don't necessarily have the resources as a planning department. I mean, our city manager's here. He knows he only has so many resources available to him. So this can be super overwhelming for a small planning department. And so I think it's a combination of taking the best of our existing planning department along with the consultants and kind of build on the experiences of the surrounding communities through the years. But also we have some really simple tools that we didn't have 5 years ago. I mean, I keep relying on SketchUp, but SketchUp is actually, you know, out of date now. I mean, it's amazing how the new technologies are helping us. So, for example, if let's say this building was built, okay? Anytime a building is built, and matter of fact, I have to do this for fire departments. I have to provide to the fire department my building in 3D. And we can easily take a finished building and insert it into this, what I'm going to call master SketchUp document, right? And so every time a building is either remodeled or otherwise, or it's a new building, you will have that data that you could put into a 3D model so that every time something's approved, we can understand what that means. And if you wouldn't mind taking us just a fly through the neighborhood, just to let you know that, you know, we'd be able to say, oh gosh, look at the impact that this is having. And you know what, because this is here, maybe this should only be three stories tall. Or maybe it could still be 4 stories tall. You might, for example, say, wow, you know, even without doing anything across the street here, this building's too small. It's dwarfed because it's surrounded by parking lot. It has a large setback. And by the way, there's all these other issues about continuity of retail. So they will tell you, you know what, people come to here, they get right here, they stop. Because they see all this dead space all the way down to here, right? And they have all these statistics that will say to you about how you lose the relationship of pedestrians to interactive retail. And a matter of fact, can't see it at the moment because it's over here, but when you walk over to Walgreens, you have to walk past this parking lot to get to Walgreens. From a urban planning standpoint, that's not a good thing because the pedestrian kind of goes, well, where am I? Right? They want to see another storefront. They want to actually mindlessly walk down Main Street from storefront to storefront to storefront. And or if they're stopping, they want to see interactive people, you know, in this new courtyard we created. So to me, this is a great tool for us to take the vision and say, what if? What if everything was 4 stories tall? Or what if, you know what, we have a couple areas where I think 4 stories would be great, but I want to have a park there to offset that so that I have more open space around it. So that's the next step. That's, to me, it's a hard step. And there's lots of tools available to do that. And I know that from at least what I've seen of the visioning documents, you have these, it's been well thought out. There's these different options available. And I think it's just making sure that people can have good visualization tools that before, like you mentioned Santa Cruz, when we've had the gentleman, the planner that came and spoke to us, that was the planner at the time, that was almost blind faith, you know, and it's turned out really well because someone would say, we need to have a strong building on this corner. And everybody said, well, okay, you know, and little by little as it started building, it created its own momentum and its own faith in the rest of the plan. And I think we have the advantage now that we have visualization tools that would allow us to do that. So, okay, thank you.